Good evening, everyone. I'm Danny Mandel. I'm the co-chair of the Sports Affinity Group, and we have a lot of participants tonight. This is a great topic, the Harlem Globetrotters. And what I want to do is, even though he's having some technical glitches, I'm going to hand it over to my buddy and the New England region special keeper of the flame,
Oh, good.
David Kravitz.
Okay, sorry guys that for some reason I'm having technical difficulties, which is par for the course of me, but okay. All right. Anyway, well, we have a good one for you tonight. Hello and welcome to the Sports Affinity webinar presented by the Federation of Jewish Men's Clubs. FJMC is the parent organization of over 250 conservative men's clubs members around the world and brings value and adds meaning to the lives of men and their families. FJMC has presented more than 100 webinars. I'm Dave Kravitz with Danny Mando, and we are co-chairs of Sports Affinity. We will be hosting tonight. We mute everyone so we can enjoy the presenters' remarks so we can take questions. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Globetrotter, how Abe Saperstein shook up the world of sports. Read the captivating biography of Abe Saperstein, originator of the Harlem Globetrotters, which is called meticulously researched and written in an easy, entertaining style by Booklist in a starred review, and a deeply researched and exquisitely written new book by the Chicago Tribune. The original Harlem Globetrotters weren't from Harlem, and they didn't start out as Globetrotters. The talented all-black team, started by Jewish immigrant Abe Saperstein, was from Chicago South Side and toured the Midwest in Saperstein's Model T. But with Saperstein's savvy and the player skills, the Globetrotters would become a worldwide sensation. Globetrotters, how Abe Saperstein shook up the world of sports, is a fascinating biography of Saperstein, a 5'3" promoter who made an amazing impact in a sport where height is at a premium, basketball. After Saperstein founded the team in the 1920s, they battled everything from blizzards to bigotry and steadily building their team. And now the authors. Mark Jacob. Mark is a graduate of Hendrix College. He is the co-author of 8 books about sports history and photography. He is the former Metro editor of the Chicago Tribune and creator of the newspaper's popular 10 Things You Might Not Know history feature. Mark's articles have been published in Library Quarterly, Chicago Reader, Chicago Magazine, Chicago History Magazine. He's a former adjunct professor at Northwestern University. Matthew Jacob. Matthew is a graduate of the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. He started his career as a journalist. Matt is a member of the Society for American Baseball Research and has written for the Boston Globe, Detroit Free Press, Los Angeles Times, and USA Today. And now, Mark and Matthew Jacob.
Sounds good. I'm sure you'll have many questions. I'm Mark. This is my brother, Matt. And this is the book we wrote called Globetrotter, How Abe Saperstein Shook Up the World of Sports. Just came out in the last month or two. We had a great time writing it. And so Matt and I live in different places. I'm in the Chicago area. Matt's in Arlington, Virginia. We like to stay close by, doing projects together. And one of them was this book, which we spent the last 2 years doing. And when we started, a friend of mine said, hey, we're looking for a biography to write. And a friend of mine said, well, have you thought about Abe Saperstein, who's from the Chicago area? And I said, well, I hadn't, but I'll look into it. And I mentioned it to Matt, and we started looking into it. And both of us knew that he'd started the Harlem Globetrotters. That's about all we knew. It just blew us away the more research we did, and we realized just how underappreciated this sports figure is and how many different things he had his hand in. We'll get into some of that in depth tonight, but not too depth. We'll let you know, and we'll leave room for questions. But Saperstein, because he had a team that was kind of part show and part sport, and the longer that the Globetrotters went on, the more they were just a show team. It didn't really, the score didn't matter, and they were playing against a team that, called the Washington Generals that they'd invented to lose to them, so it was more of a circus than it was a sport. And for that reason, I think that Saperstein has been looked down upon by sports historians. And when you look deeply at his story, which we have, you find that he's incredibly important and impactful in the way that sports is played today. We'll get into a little bit more about the three-point shot. He pioneered the three-point shot in basketball. Almost nobody knows this. And, super important. And Matt will get into it a little later about how he was a really important figure in spreading Americanism around the globe during the Cold War, working with the State Department. I mean, a lot of that is secret and was secret at the time, and our book exposes it for the first time. So there's a lot of research we've done. And Saperstein also was a giant figure in baseball, and many people don't know about that. So what I'm saying is that this book is, Globetrotter, How Abe Saperstein Shook Up the World of Sports, has a lot of stuff that you may not know, and that you'll just really kind of, like us, you'll be amazed at when you hear about it. So the team starts in Chicago, and it's called the Harlem Globetrotters because Abe Saperstein was he was an immigrant. He was born in London to Polish Jewish parents, came to Chicago as a child, and grew up in the North Side. Got a job with a park district there, and started meeting black players on the South Side of Chicago. And they realized he was the oldest of 9 kids and a very personable guy, and just got along with everyone. The neighborhood they lived in they may have been the only Jewish family in the neighborhood. It was a bunch of Irish and German families. And Saperstein played second base for the Roman Catholic school team. So he was used to breaking through ethnic and racial barriers and was great at it. And so he meets these black players on the South Side, and they are looking to do barnstorming tours in Wisconsin, Michigan, downstate Illinois, and they need somebody, a white person, to make the arrangements for them, because they're afraid that these small towns in the Midwest, they're not going to trust some black guy from Chicago. So they need Saperstein. So eventually he forms his own team called the Harlem Globetrotters. He called them Harlem to signal to these predominantly white towns that he was bringing black people into town, and that, just no surprises, he wanted everything to go well. So that's why Harlem was his code for black. And they weren't Globetrotters in any way. They were just traveling for the first few years. They were just traveling in small towns in Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, just the Midwest. They were far from Globetrotters, but Abe Saperstein was promoter. He was kind of a fake it till you make it promoter that made up a lot of stuff that was not exactly 100% true about how famous his team was and how great it was, and whether his players had gone to college or not. And so he claimed he had the best team in the world when he clearly didn't. But ultimately, because he was so successful, the Globetrotters did win the world's pro basketball championship in 1940. So they were a great team, and Saperstein was incredibly influential in a lot of things. One of the things that he was this evangelist for basketball. When he started out, basketball was a secondary sport. It was definitely behind baseball and football in popularity, and pro basketball was way below college basketball in popularity. So he really struggled in the early years. He's driving around the Midwest in a Model T Ford, with this 5'3" Jewish guy and 5 black basketball players are tooling around in Model T Ford, driving through blizzards, missing meals. Sometimes they wouldn't let the black players into hotels, and Abe would sneak them up through the back fire escape. And and the story details a lot of this. It's really interesting, all the adventures they had and the challenges they had, and just by sheer determination and force of will, he ends up building this basketball team that steadily expands its footprint, becomes very popular in the Pacific Northwest and West Coast, and finally gets overseas. And at the same time, I think you guys are probably most familiar with the Globetrotters, happy to answer questions about that. But I did want to kick it to Matt, he's more the baseball expert than me, and he really did some research that's groundbreaking in our book about Saperstein and baseball. Matt, you want to talk about that a bit?
Thanks. Appreciate it. As busy as he was in the sport of basketball, it's really quite amazing to think of all the important hats that he wore in the baseball world. First and foremost, he was a booking agent. So the connections he developed, he established as the person leading his Globetrotters into the states neighboring the greater Chicagoland area, helped him build contacts with media, with sports writers, with local sports promoters. And so those became very valuable for Negro League baseball teams because they really, in most cases, could not make the finances work if all they did was play the regularly scheduled league games. They played barnstorming games against local semi-pro teams, against college teams, against other Negro League teams, but in games that didn't count in the standings. And they would play them maybe at 2 hours away from their normal location, 3 hours away. These games were really critical because the ticket revenue they generated was what kept most Negro League teams financially afloat. He also wore the hat of owner. He was part owner of the Birmingham Black Barons, a team that played in the Negro American League. Some of you may know that a fellow by the name of Willie Mays had a brief stop in Birmingham before he went to the major leagues. Saperstein discovered one of the greatest Globetrotter basketball players of all time while he was a first baseman for Birmingham. That player's name should sound pretty familiar to many of you, Goose Tatum. Saperstein watched him, noticed his height. He was 6'3", pretty tall, especially back then in the late 1930s, early 40s. He saw the rapport that Tatum had with the fans and said, this guy's going to make a great Globetrotter. So Tatum kept playing baseball during the baseball season, but he became a Globetrotter in the fall and winter. He was also a business agent for Satchel Paige. Satchel Paige was, I say, the first free agent in baseball. And I say that because contracts didn't mean a lot to him. He would walk out on them. And people like Gus Greenlee of the Pittsburgh Crawfords were kind of forced to take him back, even though they were angry at him, because he was just such an incredible pitcher, but also because he did well at the gate. I mean, people flocked to see him because he had that showmanship as well. And so what we've discovered when we did a little analysis here, there was a point in the early 1940s where Satchel Paige, in part because of Saperstein's savvy and business and negotiating skill, helped Satchel Paige become the highest paid pitcher in baseball, black or white. It was a brief little window, but there was a point in time where we believe the evidence is solid enough to suggest that Paige was the best paid pitcher. So, I mean, that was a pretty incredible thing. And then shattering the color barrier in baseball. We all know the story of Jackie Robinson. Saperstein might not have been the first, but he played a big role in getting 5 of the first 12 black players into the major leagues. They were athletes that he had either scouted or promoted to big league clubs. They included Larry Doby, the first black player in the American League, and we'll go back to Satchel Paige. Paige at the time was the oldest rookie ever to play Major League Baseball. He turned 42 years old right before the Indians signed him, and he helped Cleveland into the World Series in 1948. So, it's. I think Mark and I were just fascinated that somebody who made such a huge impact in the field of basketball was doing a lot of stuff in the baseball world. And he was also, he was not just kind of de facto a scout. Bill Veeck of the Cleveland Indians hired him and paid him as a scout. He was a scout in other ways as well. So, I mean, a scout, an owner, a promoter, a booker. He was a publicity agent for the Negro League's All-Star Game. I mean, this guy, Mark and I sometimes would say to each other, when did he sleep? I mean, he was a dynamo.
Yeah, I mean, he started a lacrosse league in Chicago. He promoted soccer. He promoted the Ice Capades. I mean, the guy he promoted boxers. He was a manager of boxers. He none of them very successful, but the man was just incredible as far as what he got his hands into. There's a story in the book about him calling a sports writer at 2 a.m. and he just wants to talk to the sports writer at 2 a.m., not 2 p.m., 2 a.m. He wants to talk to the sports writer about how he doesn't think the Globetrotters are doing that well lately, and he just wants to shake up the team a little bit. And the sports writer is wondering why he's calling him. And it makes you wonder whether Saperstein ever slept. And it's just kind of amazing that way. I do want to talk a little bit about him and the NBA, because he had a kind of a weird relationship with the NBA. He was, just as he helped keep the the Negro Leagues afloat when they were struggling, Saperstein's really important in the survival of the NBA in its early struggling years. And it did struggle. I mean, it had teams, that quickly, started and folded. And they played in some kind of ratty gyms too. One of the gyms in New York, they had it set up to where the basketball goal, the guy wires for the basketball goal were so close to the stands that the fans could grab the wires and shake the goals as the opposing team was shooting their free throws. So I mean, it was not exactly world class, and the NBA was struggling, and Saperstein helped them greatly by agreeing to do double headers with the Globetrotters. They would play. The Globetrotters would play some other touring team, and then the second game would be a league game by the NBA, and those were often the home team's biggest gate of the entire year was when the Globetrotters came. In fact, the Globetrotters were so popular compared to the NBA that a lot of the fans after the Globetrotters game would just leave before the NBA game even happened. And that was so embarrassing to the NBA that they switched it around and played the NBA game first and then played the Globetrotters game after that, just to keep the fans in the seats. So the NBA really owed a lot to Saperstein. And the real problem was that Saperstein wanted a team of his own in the NBA. And Saperstein was just ahead of his time in a lot of ways. And one way was that he realized the West Coast was a great market for the NBA. Until the 1960s, the westernmost NBA team was in Minneapolis. So they had totally were ignoring, San Francisco and Seattle and all these other teams. And Saperstein, because he traveled with the Globetrotters for many years, knew what a great market that was. So he kept on begging them to let him have a team in Los Angeles. And they kept on ignoring him. Part of the reason was, as I say, Globetrotters had transitioned into more of a show team than a competitive pure sports team. And I think the NBA, for that reason, thought that Saperstein might be bad for their credibility. But of course, Saperstein was great for their bottom line. And another thing that's worth noting is Saperstein, just like he did in baseball, Saperstein helped integrate the NBA. The first the first black player to sign in the NBA was a Globetrotter, Sweetwater Clifton. And Saperstein's team beat the best team in the NBA, the Minneapolis Lakers, in 1948, proving that black players could play with white players. This is another thing that I think Matt and I learned while we were doing the book is these ridiculous racist misconceptions that people had about sports in the middle of the last century, to where a lot of white people actually thought that black players weren't good enough. They were bad team players or choked in the clutch. And Saperstein was determined to dispel such stupid notions. And so he was really responsible by winning that game in 1948 against the Lakers. It just became inevitable that the NBA would have to integrate. And so they did integrate. They start making money in the 50s. They won't give Saperstein a team in the 60s. And then they end up letting the Minneapolis Lakers move to Los Angeles instead of giving Abe his own franchise in Los Angeles, which he wanted. And he was mad about that. So he started a rival league called the American Basketball League. Now, the American Basketball League had a great gimmick, and that was the three-point shot. It had been tried a couple times in college games just on a lark. They had played a game in 1945 in New York in which they had tried the three-point shot, and a New York Times reporter covered the game and said that it was a stupid idea and that it should be allowed to die a natural death. And there was one other time when two college teams played it, but beyond that, nobody was trying the three-point shot. Saperstein, being a promotional genius, and he really was, decided that would be the gimmick that would get the ABL, the American Basketball League, going. And so he established that. The league only lasted a year and a half. They had a team in Honolulu, Hawaii, and the travel costs were tremendous. And there were so many other reasons. You guys being sports fans, you probably heard of George Steinbrenner. Well, he was an owner in the American Basketball League with the Cleveland Pipers, and he was a terrible owner. And he missed payroll, and he fought with all the other owners. I mean, if you were a Yankee fan and you wondered who the Steinbrenner guy was, if you'd looked at what he did with the Cleveland Pipers, you would realize what a bad, misbehaving owner he was. Anyway, so he helped bring down Abe's league, but that league is where the three-point shot was tried for the very first time. And Steph Curry and Caitlin Clark owe a debt to Abe Saperstein, whether they know it or not. And this is, I think it's, Matt, yeah, I think we'd probably agree that as far as his enduring legacy, having such a transformative rule that he was the one who made popular is really important, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Mark, you and I were chatting kind of offline a couple of days ago. There was I think a Washington Post or New York Times article about just how prominent the three-point shot continues to be. And I think they were mentioning there were some games where some of the NBA teams actually were shooting more threes than just traditional field goals. And I mean, the prominence of the three-point shot, I think it's safe to say over the last 50 years, the most significant change in basketball. Maybe you could say the shot clock, but boy, both of them were pretty huge.
Yeah, yeah. Hey, so before we turn over to questions, can you talk a little bit about, I think what is really a significant part of Globetrotter history, which is their overseas tours.
Yeah, so in the early 1950s, there was this thing called the Cold War, and many of you, if not remembering it, watching TV news and hearing your parents talk about it, you read about it and studied about it in high school and college. But uh, the State Department was very concerned about how the Soviets and their propaganda apparatus were exploiting the presence of racial discrimination in America. Secretary of State Dean Acheson in the early 50s said, racial discrimination in America is an embarrassing dynamic that threatens American leadership throughout the world. And so he was a big believer in arranging tours abroad by Black athletes or Black teams in hopes that it would help to counter that criticism in a very subtle way. And what Atchison was playing on was this understanding that people don't tend to view athletes as political figures. So kind of gives them that ability to reach ordinary people in a way that maybe a public official, a judge, a member of Congress, et cetera, could not. Atchison also heard about the large crowds that the Globetrotters had drawn in 1950 during their first European visit. So, 1952 comes along, the State Department circulates the itinerary for the Globetrotters 1952 global tour. They send it out to all U.S. diplomats abroad. And basically the message from Dean Acheson is, if this team is coming to your country, you should extend to them, quote, all appropriate courtesies and assistance. And we discovered some declassified documents at the National Archives, which really shine a light on the extraordinary lengths that the U.S. diplomatic community went to support the Globetrotters tours. In some cases, they were helping Saperstein with local publicity, sometimes printed tickets to their games. The U.S. military on a few occasions provided planes to transport the Trotters. The State Department even gathered information on the availability of arenas or stadiums or field houses, how much the rental costs would be. And most importantly, the State Department in some cases acted like a bank for Saperstein. And what I mean is this. So you get paid a pile of money in a foreign country, and with very few exceptions, those countries are going to set strict limits on how much money you can take out of the country. And so in many cases, he would have essentially had to either buy lots of gifts or products and try and ship those out. It'd be very expensive. So an arrangement that the State Department worked out for him was take your money, hand it over to the local embassy in that country, and when you fly back to the U.S., the State Department will make you whole. There was 1 year where the State Department essentially reimbursed the Globetrotters $80,000 for the local currency. And in the mid-1950s, that was a chunk of change. The State Department, from its standpoint, got some leverage because it had a relationship with Saperstein and could encourage him, hey, can you consider adding this country or that country on your next tour? It was something they felt, both of them felt good about it. And I want to be clear about something. Saperstein did not feel in any way used. He did not feel reluctant about doing this. Saperstein was a big believer in American values, and he felt very proud to do these tours with his team. And newspapers started calling the Globetrotters the diplomats in short pants. There was a There was a syndicated columnist who even mused that, hey, maybe Abe Saperstein, if people abroad could vote in U.S. elections, Saperstein might have a chance of being elected president. So, it gives you a sense of the impact he made. And of course, as Mark alluded to, the popularity of the sport, the Globetrotters being abroad, in some cases, local fans in Eastern Europe and South America were seeing basketball for the first time. And so it gave the sport a tremendous global platform and really in that respect too. But so this was a team that was seen as a diplomatic weapon, is a way to try and combat subtly what a lot of the messages that were out there. So really, really an eye-opening experience to get access to some of those documents.
And it's impossible to measure just how much impact the Globetrotters had on the world popularity of basketball, but it seems like it was enormous. They they were going to some countries that would just hadn't heard of it. What did they call it in England? What did they call it? There was a version of basketball called netball.
Netball, yeah.
The girls were playing.
Yeah,
And
middle school girls played a game called netball. But at that time in the early 50s, basketball, as we know it today, was played only sporadically. It hadn't really taken hold. So Saperstein contacts the manager of Wembley Stadium in London and says, hey, I'd like to bring the team there, make you one of the first stops on my European tour. And the general manager quite bluntly, and he felt honestly, said, it won't go. Don't waste your time here. I don't want to see you take a loss. I don't think you'll get many fans. Well, they did get many fans. In fact, so many that they had to add an extra date. BBC decided to televise one of their games, and they reported later it was the best rated program other than ones produced directly by BBC for that entire week. So, I mean, he went into a lot of countries where you would have thought, yeah, is this really going to fly? Will people take to it? And his team really put basketball on the map.
he had basketball courts pre-positioned in different places in the world, right? Can you talk about that just a little?
I think one was in the Philippines. I think he had one in Australia, one in South America. So, in many areas of the world, the infrastructure, the field houses, not always consistent. And in some cases, you weren't even getting a real hard court. You have to think back about this, right? 1936, the famous Olympics with Jesse Owens. That year was the first Olympics that basketball was played in. And the final game, I believe, was between Canada and the US. It was played on a field of mud because they weren't indoors. They played outdoors on a tennis court. And it got very muddy because it had rained. And so, I mean, it took a while for basketball to get the kind of appreciation where there were really spaces that were ideal for it. And so, Saperstein, as the early 50s came around, said, I don't want to take any chances. I want my team to be playing on, proper court. And so they had these things staged so that those courts were portable, that were broken down. They could be assembled in, an hour or two, wherever they went. And it was a very meticulous operation, but the logistics, as you can imagine, Mark, were pretty incredible. The U.S. won. Somebody, just a chat asked, who won that Olympics 1936? The U.S. did.
Yeah, Canadian just asked you. That's why I asked.
So I guess before we take questions, I just wanted to just say something about why, because Matt and I asked us a question is why isn't Saperstein better known, and why doesn't he get credit for things? And one is, sometimes nobody knows who pioneered the 3-point shot in basketball, and I think a lot of basketball fans today think that it was always that way. That nobody invented it. It's just the way it was. No, it wasn't. Until the 1960s, there was no league play with 3-point shot, and the book gets into the evolution of the game too. Like until 1938, there was after a team made a basket, they did a jump ball at center court. The other team didn't take the ball out. Every time there was a made basket, they went to center court and had to jump ball. So the game has been changing, through the years. And Saperstein had, was very influential, but people don't know that. So that's one reason he's not famous. He's famous for the Globetrotters, but also there was kind of a transformation in his image that happened because of American culture. Because I think in the 40s and 50s, he would have been seen as almost like a social justice warrior, as somebody who was really displaying the talents of Black people. And then the civil rights movement happens, and I think a lot of Black activists didn't want to be considered clowns on a basketball court. They wanted more respect from that, and they didn't want that to be one of their main images. Plus, you had people who called it a minstrel show because he was bringing Black entertainers on to make people laugh, so I think that because of that, it seemed like his image faltered a little bit. And that's why, Matt and I, as we did this book, we just found so many interesting facts. And if you read the book, I think you'll just be amazed by all the things we found. And we've said, well, why is this the first biography of Abe Saperstein? And I think that's part of the reason, that he was not really considered a sportsman as much as a showman. And he wasn't, and as a showman, he wasn't exactly doing Broadway shows. So he almost like fell between two different categories of celebrity. And it was incredibly influential in a lot of ways. And one other thing I want to say is, Matt and I talked about this. The man was a visionary in a lot of ways. I mean, he saw pay TV for, cable TV for, decades before it became popular. He thought that was going to make a lot of money for sports teams. He was pushing for night games way early before, in baseball, before other people were. He was calling for, talk about the variable ticket pricing, Matt.
Yeah, in the mid 1950s, Saperstein is interviewed by a sports columnist, and he says, it's kind of crazy, that the Yankees go into Cleveland and the fans are paying the same price that they would when the St. Louis Browns come in to play them. The Yankees are a pretty popular team. It seems like you should charge a different amount of money. Let that shape your ticket pricing. So here's somebody raising the concept of dynamic pricing and ticketing, something that now is quite common, not just in baseball, but in other sports, which, back then nobody was thinking about it. And it was decades before that really became embraced. But this was a guy who woke up every morning and seemed to look at the sports world around him and said, what if we did this? Why don't they do this? I mean, he really pushed the envelope, and he really challenged a lot of the establishment. And that's how he also ruffled a lot of feathers that way, though.
That's another reason why he didn't get an NBA team, is he spent, at the same time he was helping NBA attendance, he was also constantly criticizing them for poor play in the press. I mean, he'd like to talk to the sports writers. In fact, he was a big pal of the sports writers. He used to send them boxes of apples every Christmas and stuff like that. I mean, he really fostered good relations with the press. And, he would like buy them gifts and have lunches for them and all that. And, but he was always a good quote, but sometimes the quotes were really singing toward the NBA. And I think that kind of hurt him as far as getting an NBA team too. He almost got an NFL team. He said the biggest mistake of his career was he had an offer for $250,000 to buy the San Francisco 49ers, and he turned him down. And a few years after that, they got a big TV contract, the NFL did, and he realized that he'd made a horrible mistake. So that was one of the few mistakes he made. Matt, anything else you want to say before we take questions?
No, well, I think we're ready to dive in.
Well, you have a lot of questions. There were actually some questions sent beforehand. And so one of the questions was also asked on the chat, and that one is, who currently owns the Harlem Globetrotters?
It's a Hirshhand company. It's a company based in Georgia that they own Silver Dollar City and in Dollywood also. So they're into kind of family-oriented entertainment. The Globetrotters have been sold about half a dozen times since Abe died. Abe died in '66. And some members of his family wanted to keep the team in the family, but the inheritance taxes were so onerous that they had to sell. And it was passed around, to 6 different times about. It's still going, and actually they have a fairly new TV program on Saturday mornings for kids. So it's still going concern.
So one of the questions also asked beforehand, which I think is a great one, did Abe Saperstein choose black players because most of the professional players were white?
Yeah, I don't think that would be an accurate conclusion. I think as Mark said, his position working in the Parks District of Chicago, these are young athletes he got to know, and he built some relationship with them, and there was a level of trust, and when they thought about trying to form a team and go out barnstorming to neighboring states, he was all in, and it just kind of played out that way. I don't think it was a kind of conscious thing. But I do think that somebody, I know one of the chat questions was, did the Globetrotters ever beat an NBA team? And that was also answered by somebody else. Yes, they beat the Minneapolis Lakers in that 1948 game. And I think there are a lot of writers, ESPN analysts, and others who have said, you want to look at the moment when the NBA said, why are we still segregated? You could trace it back to that night, that game, when the Globetrotters surprised the world by beating the Lakers, and saying, why don't we have any of these really incredibly talented players, and why are we keeping them out just because they're black? So I don't think early on, though, his decision to kind of take the Globetrotters around was consciously hey, I'm going to form a black team. I think, and Mark, you can talk a little more about this, but I think it was very much, these were young players he got acquainted with. And Mark, talk about this. Like in 1919, like literally 8 or 9 years before the Globetrotters are formed, there's this thing called the 1919 race riot in Chicago. And so black and white young males were not hanging out a lot together. So this was really quite unique in itself.
Yeah, and the thing about that is, I mean, ultimately, as he got going and became more famous, the Globetrotters did, having black players was part of their brand. So they only had a few white players ever play for the Globetrotters. During World War II. A guy named Karstens played for him and actually came up with some of their trick passes. But Abe benefited from not being a racist. I mean, because so many other teams were not accepting black players, and as the Globetrotters went on, they kind of had their pick of the best black basketball players in the country. So the fact that he was open-minded about that, he benefited from other people's racism and bigotry, and he showed it to be foolish.
Excellent. So I learned something tonight. There was a movie from my friend Aaron Altman called Go Man Go.
That's right.
And the question is, and then we'll have to go stream that, right? Question is, talk about the accuracy of Abe as he's portrayed in that movie.
Well, I mean, what's remarkable about that movie is, and by the way, Sidney Poitier plays Inman Jackson. Inman Jackson, we haven't mentioned him yet, but we should, because this book has more about Inman Jackson than any other book that's been published. And Inman Jackson was one of the first great Globetrotters and was Abe's best friend, stood up at his wedding, just a person who was Abe's, was the guy who sat in Abe's hospital room when he was dying. I mean, Inman Jackson was his best friend. And Inman Jackson is portrayed in this movie, and Sidney Poitier plays Inman Jackson in an early Poitier role. And I think the movie is remarkable by the fact that it shows white people and black people being perfectly comfortable around each other, like sitting around the kitchen table, having meals together, all this, which was not the kind of thing you were seeing in most of American society at the time. And a lot of the Globetrotters who were actual players are in that movie. And they playing themselves. Marcus Haynes is in that movie. Marcus Haynes was one of the great dribblers in Globetrotters history. In fact, he once dribbled out the entire fourth quarter of a game because there was no shot clock then, and so he dribbled for the entire fourth quarter. He was a great dribbler, and there's a scene in that movie where Marcus Haynes is dribbling down the hallway of a hotel. And Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, in an interview, said that he saw that movie as a kid, and it influenced him to realize that he had to be a good ball handler. Just because he was incredibly tall didn't mean he'd be a good basketball player. He had to, so he tried to emulate Marcus Haynes and really develop good ball handling skills. So he got that he was influenced by the movie Go Man Go. Now, the funny thing about the Go Man Go is that, or not funny, haha, but funny odd, is that it got caught up in the whole Red Scare, blacklisting in Hollywood. In fact, the guy who wrote the screenwriter for that movie had to pretend not to be the screenwriter and had, I think it was his dentist brother took the credit for it, and the screenwriter only got credit for writing that movie in 1999. Just before he died. So it was a movie that tried to portray, tried to just kind of push past the racism in society overall, and yet doing that kind of made you kind of a lefty back then in the Red Scare years.
So speaking of racism and integration, there's a question. So once the NBA did integrate and accepted Black players, was it harder for the Globetrotters to get quality players?
Well, yeah, but by that time, that was yes. The answer is yes, but it kind of coincided with them transitioning to a completely show team rather than a competitive basketball team. Because the NBA integrated in 1950, and in 1952 is when Abe got his friend Red Klotz to start the Washington Generals, which was a team that traveled with them, named after Eisenhower, who was running for president that year, General Eisenhower. And so they were, their job was to travel with the Globetrotters and play them a competitive game and be just good enough to lose. And so by that time, as the 50s went on, it became more of a show team. And if you were a really competitive enough basketball player, you would just go to the NBA. You wouldn't go to the Globetrotters. But Wilt Chamberlain was a Globetrotter. And Wilt Chamberlain, this was in the late 50s. Wilt Chamberlain was with the University of Kansas. He didn't want to play his last year of college basketball. And they had a rule then that until your graduating class graduated, you couldn't join the NBA. So he had a year in which he had to wait to join the NBA, and he spent that with the Globetrotters. And he loved the Globetrotters. He's a big friend of Abe's. This is another thing, and you'll find out in the book, is that Saperstein was a good friend of Jesse Owens, of Satchel Paige, of Wilt Chamberlain. Some of the greatest athletes in American history were close friends of Saperstein. And Wilt Chamberlain traveled with the Globetrotters during the summer, even into the 60s, on their European tours. And this is something would be completely inconceivable in the NBA today, is that you're letting your best player play basketball with another team in the offseason, where he could risk injury or whatever. But Chamberlain said that he had the most fun he ever had playing basketball was with the Globetrotters.
And you actually answered one of the questions that was in the chat. So here's an interesting question. I'm sure you guys understand it better than me. Was Saperstein still involved when the Globetrotters made the big time and teamed up with Scooby-Doo?
Yeah, that series, that TV series was several years beyond Saperstein's death. But I would contend that the Globetrotters had definitely established plenty of fame, not yet Scooby fame, but had attained fame of a different sort while Saperstein was still very much alive. And, it's really fascinating to step back and realize an all-black team headed by a Jewish man was inspiring two major motion pictures, right? Not just movies somebody made, but we're talking about major film studios making these. We mentioned Go Man Go. There was another one that was just titled Globetrotters, but within several years of each other. They appeared on the Ed Sullivan TV show 5 times during Saperstein's life. Of course, that was one of the highest rated programs in TV history. They were given a personal audience with the Pope 4 times. Milton Bradley Company created a Harlem Globetrotters board game a few years after he died. The Globetrotters were featured on bubblegum cards made by Fleer. I mean, this was a team that really made not just a sports impact, but a big cultural footprint it left behind. So the Scooby thing kind of was, I would like to think that Abe helped to set some of that up, but that did happen several years. I think that happened around 70 or 71 that they signed that deal.
And one of our participants also would like you to know that they were on Gilligan's Island and were wondering if they got off. Maybe not.
I think they got off. I've never seen that show. I did when we were doing a research. I did notice it, which seemed like the most absurd movie, made for TV movie you could possibly imagine. And that was post Abe's death too. He died in '66 at the age of 63. Sure did pack a lot of living into 63 years.
So one thing I remember watching them as a kid was the theme song, "Sweet Georgia Brown." And how did that get selected?
You know, there were about a handful of stories about how it got selected. That the song was actually written, a couple decades before the Globetrotters adopted it, and it was. But there was a version of it, and the song, by the way, is a collaboration of a Jewish composer and a black composer too, which is kind of interesting considering that's what the Globetrotters were, is a partnership between Jews and blacks in America. So it was, so anyways, the story, the song is, there's a popular song by Brother Bones is the name of the group that did it, with using, bones and whistling and all that. And there are various stories. It's one of those things where I'm from the Chicago area, and back in Chicago history, almost every newspaperman claimed to be the first person at the scene of the St. Valentine's Day massacre. Is one of those things where everyone wants to like claim success or claim that you did something that was, part of fame. And so there are various members of the Globetrotters organization who claimed that they were the first people to come up with the idea. But, so it's one of those things, it's one of those stories where you can't really, discern who was telling the truth and who's not. But it came to their attention, and they played it one night, and the players loved it and the fans loved it, and it became a huge hit. And it was actually a big moneymaker for the Globetrotters. We found a news clip in which at one basketball game, they sold 500 copies of that record at halftime. So it was a very successful song. They still use it. Matt and I were down at the University of Texas doing research. That's where the Globetrotters archives are, at the University of Texas. And we timed it for when the Globetrotters were playing a game there at the university in Austin. And, a lot of the old stuff was still happening. They were still playing Sweet Georgia Brown, still doing the magic circle. They do it, with the trick passes at the start of the game, and still doing the old football trick they did where they try to kick a basketball into the goal and stuff like that. So a lot of the little clowning routines continue this day.
So a couple of more questions. I'm assuming that Abe is not in the Basketball Hall of Fame in Springfield, Massachusetts.
He is.
He is. Well, that's a good thing.
Well, it's interesting. He is. In fact, he's probably the shortest guy in the basketball. And we did a guy who really was helpful to us in our project was Manny Jackson. I mentioned that the Globetrotters were owned by about half a dozen different entities. One of them was Manny Jackson, who was a very smart guy, graduate of the University of Illinois, played with the Globetrotters in the early '60s, but clearly was going to be going to the corporate world. And Abe took him under his wing, taught him the business, taught him. Abe Manny, when I interviewed him, said that Abe taught him a lot of what he knew about, how businesses are run. So Manny plays for a few years with the Globetrotters, and then he starts his own because he ends up doing well in the corporate world, and then becoming the owner. And so when that interview was so good that when Manny Jackson, we asked him if he would write the foreword, and he did. So he's written the foreword for the book. I'm not sure I answered your question though. Can you repeat it? I got off on Manny Jackson.
Well,
That's okay.
He just asked you about whether Abe was in the Abe
In
Saperstein.
Springfield.
Oh,
yeah,
I know
Yeah.
that was the connection that I didn't
yeah.
make, which was that Manny is really big in the Basketball Hall of Fame and has given him a lot of money. So So in fact, he told me that he was pushing him to name the garden outside the building the Saperstein Garden. So he's a big fan of Abe's and his influence because, Abe was so kind to him when he was a young man. And so Manny, so I think Manny made sure he got into actually he got into the Hall of Fame before Manny even got involved in it. Very soon. John Wooden, you guys are sports fans. John Wooden, the famous UCLA basketball coach, he ended up helping endorse Saperstein getting into the Hall of Fame. Saperstein got in the Hall of Fame in the early 70s, and the Globetrotters got in the late 90s as a team.
Okay.
And several other we figured that you could field more than 2 teams of the Globetrotters under Saperstein who are in the Hall of Fame now. Inman Jackson, who I mentioned, was recently in. Like they did in Major League Baseball, they had this kind of committee that looked for overlooked black players from the racist days that they could recognize, and Inman Jackson was one of them. And Inman Jackson is really important and underappreciated too, because he came up with a lot of the Globetrotters routines.
How about Meadowlark Lemon?
Well, and Meadowlark Lemon's real name is Meadow Lemon. I mean, they added the lark part just to be even more, better marketing. But he was, and that one of the funniest things that we learned about Meadowlark Lemon is that when he told Saperstein he wanted to be, when he was young, even before he joined the Globetrotters, he met Saperstein and told him he was going to be with the team someday. And then when Goose Tatum had a contract dispute and just kind of disappeared and Abe fired him, he made Meadowlark Lemon the kind of clown prince showman who did that. And when Wilt Chamberlain played for the Globetrotters, Meadowlark Lemon was already in the post. He was already the tall guy. So Wilt Chamberlain played point guard for the Globetrotters.
Interesting.
I mean, he was such a great athlete that he could, that he could play point guard at 7'1".
So we're going to wrap up, but this is the Federation of Jewish Men's Club, so we did want to throw in a couple of Jewish questions for you. So, did they ever go to Israel, the Globetrotters, and play?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, they did. And Saperstein himself made a few, pilgrimages and trips there as well. I think he felt a definite connection to the Jewish state, and they made it to the Soviet Union in 1959. A lot of people thought, that's not going to happen. Give up on it, and Saperstein did not give up on that. But they got to a lot of places. When he had the one place that he didn't get to was mainland China, back before Hong Kong was part of mainland China. Right? He went to Hong Kong, but never actually played in the People's Republic.
He gave the money for a community center in Israel. That was one of the he would do kind of good acts whenever he was over there.
And did he ever speak, or was there any overt instances of anti-Semitism that he experienced, or is there any mention of that?
Oh goodness, yeah. There's we include some of those in the book as well. I mean, it was amazing what people would write very openly and didn't seem the least bit embarrassed about it. There was one sports columnist who talked about, the Globetrotters for the last several nights have filled the stands in this area, and boy, the ticket revenue they got must just be huge, and and of course somebody like Abe Saperstein should know, because how much those people know about money. So you kind of hear these things, and Mark and I are looking at them from the perspective of 2023 and going, okay, but Mark, you stumbled on the one, I think it was a Texas columnist who managed to be 60s. Racist and anti-Semitic in the same sentence.
Right. They're it's a sports writer in Texas, and he's in the 60s. I mean, where you would think they would have learned something. And they say, well, during the magic circle, the Globetrotter players dropped the ball twice, and old Massa Saperstein is going to cut their ration of chitlins and bagels, and so he manages to be, anti-Semitic and anti-Black at this in one sentence. So yeah, Abe did encounter that. I mean, he blew past it though. I mean, instead of being resentful about it, he was just going to prove that, that bigotry was a bad idea. And it's interesting. we get into in the book, but the role of a Jewish person in sports of that time was really interesting. Manny Jackson, the guy who I talked about, who was the owner who wrote the foreword to the book, he told us he thought that Saperstein was kind of the go-between between these black players and the white world. That he was kind of had a foot in both worlds. He was like the black players, he was the other also, but he could actually be a go-between. And I mean, in the whole, it's a real interesting subject in American history, the black Jewish dynamic. And this book is really gets into that too, about how, there were, like in the Negro Leagues, Matt didn't get into this because it's not an important detail, but there were black people who thought that Jews were having too much influence in Negro Leagues baseball. But that was a mixed bag because the same people who were complaining about it were also admitting that that's why they were still in business, is because these Jewish promoters were helping, helping make them money. So, I mean, it's an interesting dynamic. There's a story that's never been told before that's in the book that we learned from it's family lore in the Saperstein family. And Abe's like one of his, I think it was in the first, it was either the first or the second time they were in Europe. They were in Germany. And this is only, think about this. This is like the early 50s. It's 5 or 6 years after the end of World War II. And Abe's there with his like 13-year-old daughter, Eloise. And he's having a press conference because he's, which is what he did. And she went down to the front desk and said, can you tell me where the Jewish section of town is? I want some Jewish food. And I mean, she's just a dumb teenager. I don't think she understood, or preteen. And I don't think she understood, what was the whole context of that, of asking, in Germany, asking where the Jewish section was. And the concierge, or bellman said, Hitler should have gotten rid of all you people and spit at her. And she was so upset, she went up to where the press conference was happening, told her father about it. Abe immediately stops the press conference and takes her to the jewelry store next door to the hotel and orders a Star of David pendant for her that she always wore for the rest of her life. And no, we'd never read this in any other book. It's a family story that Abe's daughter told many times. In fact, Abe's daughter bought her own children a copy of that Star of David pendant for when they turned 16, for the two daughters she had. And I think it's a true story. I mean, we never read it anywhere, but in those days, I think sports writers would have shied away from it. They were trying to write a happy story about this successful American team touring Europe, and I don't know that they would have, even if they'd seen it happen, that they would have reported it.
So we're over an hour, so you guys are just absolutely terrific, and we can't thank you enough. I think the 80 people that were on here tonight would like to know where they can buy your book, because I think you would get 80 orders right now.
Well,
All right. Well, this is what it looks like, except
Amazon is obviously one place to go. Barnes and Noble. It's pretty much available at all major booksellers, and you can also go to the publisher's site, Roman and Littlefield. But it's on Amazon, both in the physical book form, but also kind of the electronic Kindle. So yeah, check it out.
It's easier to get online than at bookstores. Some bookstores might have it, but online is the way to go. And it makes a great holiday gift. I mean, it's just, I mean, we're really proud of it because, and it deals with serious subjects, as you know, from this last hour, but it's also a lot of fun. I mean, it tells a lot. There are great anecdotes. It's a bunch of brave, audacious people doing something unusual in America.
Well, this was just terrific. I'm going to let David wrap up.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you, Danny. So first of all, I want to thank everyone that attended this Sports Affinity webinar, and obviously my co-host, Danny Mando, and Steve Lespin for contacting our speakers. And of course, my IT mavens who were just absolutely phenomenal tonight. Rick Ronsberg, Mark Givers, Stan Greenspan, and Creighton Cohn. Guys really came through because we had some technical issues and they solved them as usual. Our guest speakers, Mark Jacob and Matt Jacob, I think their presentation was absolutely phenomenal. And as a basketball fan, I was sitting here and I was like, wow, this, and I've seen the Globetrotters play a couple of times, so I know, just to see them, it was amazing. So I really want to thank you for your presentation. It was incredible. And let you guys know, we have a speaker coming up in January. We are just going to get the date squared away. His name is Mark Rosenstein, and you don't want to miss this one. He's a winning multimedia journalist. He was a team leader for the NFL, ESPN, and Comcast. So this is going to be a really good one. We're just working on the date. And I want to thank everybody, and good night.
So,
Thank you.
Mark and Matt, you have to understand Dave. Dave used to be a big sports fan. He used to like all sports, but he lives like me, he lives in the Boston area. So now he just likes basketball because everyone else sucks.
Well, in Chicago, you wouldn't like any sports. If you,
Right, that's true. Could always be worse, right?
Hey, the Red Sox are supposedly going after Soto. We'll see if that happens.
Yes,
Yeah, we'll see. Well, I'll believe it when I see it.
yeah, me
Yeah.
too. All right, everyone. Thank you so much.
Bus is lining
Thank
up
you.
money for him.
Yeah. Have a good night. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and happy
Thank you, everybody.
Thanksgiving.
Happy
And the
Thursday.
Canadians, happy Thursday.
Exactly.
Yeah, happy
Happy
Thursday,
Thursday.
everyone.
Happy
Happy
Thursday.
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 All right, guys. Thank you.